At restless dawn. Okay, let's dive into the early morning. Just imagine. The darkness is still almost total, the kind that weighs on your eyes. There you are, squeezed shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other men inside a floating metal box, one of those landing craft, an LCVP, which they call a Higgins boat. The smell is a suffocating mix of burning diesel, salt water, and the unmistakable sour odor of vomit. Many there could not stand the combination of the incessant rocking of the sea and the lump in their throats caused by fear. The boat bobs and bobs, bobs and bobs in the choppy waves of the English Channel. Each jolt sends icy water over the railing, soaking the already damp uniforms even more, making the cold fabric stick to the skin. The cold cuts through, seeps into the bones, but hardly anyone seems to notice. The tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one says much. The silence is heavy, broken only by the steady roar of the diesel engine, the sound of water lapping against the hull, and the occasional coughing fit or the guttural sound of another soldier heaving his breath. Look around in the dim light. You see silhouettes, pale faces briefly illuminated by the foam of the waves. Some of the young men, too young to be there, try to look tough, but their wide, staring eyes betray their terror. Others, older, veterans perhaps, have their jaws clenched, their knuckles white where they grip their M1 rifles. It is a silent, shared fear that hangs. In the air like an invisible mist, each man is lost in his own dark thoughts, wondering what awaits them on that unknown shore that looms in the darkness. And then there is the sound. Over the roar of the engine and the sea, you begin to hear it. A low, distant rumble, almost a vibration felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. Boom! Boom! It's the battleships behind you, the giants of the fleet, hammering the coast with their heavy artillery. It's the bombs from the planes that passed before, trying to soften up the German defenses, precursor bombs. To the men there, in that rocking boat, each distant boom is not a relief, but a brutal reminder of the hell that is about to break loose. It's the promise of carnage that awaits them. The dawn is restless, charged with a deadly electricity, and the beach is getting closer and closer. The infernal approach. Now things get even more brutal. The Higgins speedboat is not a luxury cruise ship, my friend. It is a metal bathtub thrown into a rough sea. It rocks with a violence that throws you from side to side without mercy. Holding on is almost impossible. The men cling to the sides, to their companions, to anything that offers a minimum of support, but the waves are relentless. One moment you are being thrown upward, almost floating. The next instant, your stomach drops as the speedboat sinks into a trough between gigantic waves. And the water, oh, the salty, icy water of the canal keeps on coming. It's not just splashes, it's whole waves that wash over the makeshift deck, soaking everyone to the bone. No one is dry. The weight of the wet uniform, the helmet, the combat gear, rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, everything seems to weigh an extra ton. It's a Herculean effort just to stay upright, to keep from being thrown overboard or crushed against the metal structure. Seasickness, which was already bad, now becomes torture. The smell of vomit intensifies because more and more men can no longer hold it in. They lean over the railing, emptying what little they had in their stomachs, a bitter mixture of bile and fear. It is humiliating, debilitating, but there is nothing to be done. The sea is unforgiving, and the body reacts to this infernal rocking and extreme tension. And then, through the grey, damp mist of the morning, which is timidly beginning to lighten, it appears. First, a shapeless, dark, almost ghostly shadow on the horizon. Then, slowly, its contours become defined. It is not a welcoming sight. It is the Normandy coastline, but not like in the photos or on the maps. It is a menacing coastline with cliffs that look like jagged teeth pointing towards the sky, shrouded in a mist that hides the danger. You do not see enemy soldiers, you do not see the guns pointed, but you know they are there. Every shadow, Every indentation in the coast looks like a machine gun nest waiting to spit fire. The sight of dry land, which should be a relief, only increases the sense of dread. That coastline is not a refuge. It is the den of the wolf, and your little motorboat, shaking violently, is heading straight for it. The opening of the gates of hell, expanded version. The harsh sound of the speedboat's keel scraping against the sand and gravel hidden beneath the shallow water is a physical shock, a jolt that runs down the spine of everyone on board. The constant sickening roar of the diesel engine sputters, slows, and a relative tense silence falls over the vessel, broken only by the splash of water against the hull and the cold wind whistling over the rail. In this sudden silence, the commanding officer in charge's shouts sound strangely thin, almost lost in the confined space. 30 seconds. Stand by. Check equipment. The adrenaline, already running wild, now floods the system like a powerful drug. The heart doesn't just beat. It hammers against the ribs, a frantic drum in the chest. The mouth goes dry, the throat tightens. The men shift. Instinctively, a collective movement of tense bodies. Sweaty hands check the safety catch on the M1 rifle for the 10th time. Adjust the strap of the steel helmet that feels as heavy as lead. Feel the weight of the grenades on their belts. Faces, pale in the shadows, are now livid in the grey, dim light of the advancing dawn. Eyes are wide, fixed on the steel wall of the ramp ahead. That metal plate is the last thin barrier between the relative and illusory safety of the boat and the absolute unknown. On the other side is not just occupied France. It is the entrenched enemy, guns trained, the cold promise of death. Then came the sound everyone had feared and expected. A sharp, metallic snap, almost painful to the ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy chains sliding over rusty pulleys. Clank, screech, groan. The heavy landing stage begins its descent. It is not a quick, merciful drop. It is a slow, agonizing movement, almost theatrical in its cruelty. Inch by inch, the ramp lowers, gradually revealing the scene outside. First, the shallow, foaming water, then the wet, dark sandbar, and then the wider beach, the shadowy obstacles, and in the background, the indistinct rises of dunes and cliffs, shrouded in morning mist. For a moment frozen in time, there is near silence. Just the sound of the ramp creaking and the water lapping. A moment of unbearable suspense. And then, all hell breaks loose. Before the tip of the ramp even touches the water, before the first man can even think about taking the first step out, the air explodes into a deafening cacophony. It is no longer the distant, almost comforting thunder of Allied naval artillery. It is the intimate, up-close, personal, and terrifyingly lethal sound of enemy fire focused directly on the opening of your launch. The dry, rapid crack of the Mauser K98K rifles mixes with the sound that will become the soundtrack of the nightmare. The continuous, rapid, and brutal tearing of the MG-42 machine guns. Hitler's saw. The sound comes from multiple directions, from the concrete bunkers camouflaged in the cliffs, from the machine gun nests hidden in the folds of the dunes, creating a deadly crossfire that turns the opening of the boat into a funnel of destruction. Sparks explode from the steel ramp as the bullets hit it, ricocheting with a high-pitched ringing sound. Metal shards fly like shrapnel inside the boat. The water directly in front of the ramp boils, bubbles, as if an invisible incandescent hailstorm is falling upon it. And the men, oh, the men in the front row, those who, by lot or position, were destined to be the heroes, the first to set foot on liberated France. They do not take a step. They are hit full on. The instant the protection of the ramp disappears, bodies are thrown violently backward, like rag dolls struck by an invisible force, falling on their comrades behind. Shrill cries of pain and surprise are instantly drowned out by the roar of the guns. The air inside the launch suddenly becomes heavy, thick with the acrid metallic smell of burning gunpowder, and almost at the same moment, with the hot, sweet, nauseating odor of fresh blood and exposed viscera. The door opened, yes, but not to freedom. It opened straight into the hungry mouth of hell, and hell was not waiting passively. It came to greet them at the threshold with an embrace of steel and fire. The MG-42's deadly hailstorm, expanded version. The instant the ramp began to lower, before the mind could even fully process the sight of the hostile beach, the sound came. It was no ordinary battle sound, not the familiar crack of rifles or the explosion of mortars. It was something new, something viscerally terrifying. A sharp, continuous, incredibly fast ripping of the air itself. A furious mechanical whirring sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A giant circular saw cutting not through wood, but through the fabric of reality. It was the Maschinengewehr 42, the MG-42, Hitler's saw, the bone harvester, and it was singing its death song, spewing 7.92-minute rounds at a blistering rate, between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, so fast that the human ear could barely distinguish the individual shots, blending them into a single, continuous, deadly roar. And the worst part, there wasn't just one. There were several, positioned with diabolical precision in concrete pillboxes, fortified nests, and interconnected. Trenches along the ridges that overlooked the beach. The German gunners, well trained and protected, had been waiting for this moment. They had adjusted their sights, calculated the angles. The opening of the speedboat's ramp was the invitation, and they responded with a storm of steel. The crossfire was perfect. Machine guns from different positions concentrated their fire on the narrow opening of the boat, creating a killing zone from which it was almost impossible to escape. It was like trying to walk through a torrential rain. But instead of drops of water, there were incandescent bullets traveling at almost 800 meters per second. You could see the bright lines of tracer bullets, one every 5 or 10 bullets, slicing through the gray air like deadly red lasers, converging mercilessly on the ramp and the water beyond. Wherever the lines passed, they left a trail of unimaginable destruction. The men in the front row, the ones who were tensed and ready to jump, didn't stand a chance. They simply disintegrated. It wasn't a clean puncture wound. It was a brutal kinetic force that pulverized flesh and bone. Bodies were ripped in half, limbs torn off, heads exploded in a grotesque mist of blood, brains and helmet fragments. Shreds of uniform and equipment were thrown into the air along with the red rain. The water in front of the boat, once grey and foaming, was now boiling like a kettle on the stove. Hundreds of bullets hit the surface every second, sending up violent geysers of water and foam in a deadly, chaotic pattern. The steel ramp itself, which should have offered some protection, screamed under the relentless impact. Bullets ricocheted with sharp, dangerous whines inside the confined space of the boat, while others tore through the metal like cardboard, striking men who thought themselves safe farther back. Protection was a cruel illusion. The noise was a physical assault on the senses. The cacophony of metal striking, the deafening roar of the MG-42s, the screams of agony that were abruptly silenced, all merged into a sonic pandemonium that overwhelmed the mind. It was impossible to think clearly, impossible to hear orders, impossible to react in an organized fashion. The order was to get out, advance, take the beach. But how? How to advance against that invisible but terrifyingly real wall of lead and death? That initial volley of MG-42s was not just suppressive fire to keep heads down. It was deliberate slaughter, a calculated attempt to annihilate the assault force before it could even form up on the beach. It was the purest, most brutal embodiment of the unimaginable horror that awaited that red tide. It was Hitler's saw in full operation, reaping lives with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Dive into frozen chaos, expanded version. With the front ramp turned into a curtain of fire and death by the MG-42s, the only alternative for those still alive and minimally functional was to go around the sides. A desperate leap out of the relative and now non-existent safety of the boat, straight into the icy and turbulent embrace of the English Channel. But hell had many levels, and the water was just the next circle. Many of the boat drivers, under extreme stress, desperately trying to avoid the concentrated fire or simply lost in the smoke, fog, and chaos of the waves, stopped far short of their ideal position. Instead of waist-deep shallow water, the men found themselves jumping into treacherous holes, unexpected sandbars, or simply into water that was too deep to their chests, necks, or worse, over their heads. For a soldier loaded down like a pack mule, 60, sometimes 90 pounds of wet gear, the heavy M1 Garand rifle, multiple clips of ammunition, grenades strapped to his vest, the field backpack with rations and personal items, the entrenching shovel, the full canteen, the steel helmet, the heavy boots, and the sodden wool uniform. This unexpected depth was a death sentence by drowning. The thermal shock was brutal and instantaneous, leaving the claustrophobic and relatively warm confines of the speedboat warmed by body heat and adrenaline, and diving into the 10 degrees Celsius water was like being hit with an icy hammer. The air was forced from your lungs in an involuntary gasp. Muscles contracted violently. Breathing became difficult, almost impossible for the first few seconds. But there was no time to acclimatize, no time for your body to adjust. As soon as you submerged, the relentless weight of your equipment began to act like a lead anchor, pulling you down into the murky, cold darkness. The water was an opaque mix of sand, salt, and who knows what else. Visibility was almost zero. Your primal instinct screamed to fight, to swim, to reach the surface in the precious air. But how? Your arms and legs, already weighed down by your soaked uniform, struggled against the added weight of the gear that seemed determined to drag you down. You could see the silhouettes of other men around you, struggling in a silent, macabre dance beneath the water. Arms flailing, legs kicking frantically, air bubbles rising like desperate pearls. Many tried in panic to free themselves from the deadly burden. They tried to undo the buckles on their backpacks, to unhook the heavy ammunition belt, but their fingers were numb from the cold, clumsy. The buckles, wet and perhaps already rusty, stuck. The panic increased with each passing second without air, making their movements even more uncoordinated. Some, with luck or superhuman willpower, managed to free themselves from part of the weight, emerging to the surface gasping for air, spitting salt water, their eyes wide with terror, only to be greeted by stray bullets that whistled and ricocheted off the surface, turning the search for air into Russian roulette. Others were not so lucky. They were being pulled inexorably downward. Their lungs burned like fire. Their vision began to darken at the edges, dotted with strange lights. The sound of the chaos above grew muffled, distant. Their last sight might be the filtered, greenish light of the surface receding, unreachable. Just yards from the beach, just yards from the objective they had trained for months, they drowned. Silent, anonymous victims of the treacherous combination of the weight of their equipment, the unexpected depth of the water, the paralyzing cold, and the absolute chaos of the battle. Even for those lucky enough to land in shallower, waist or chest-deep water, the situation was desperate. Every step towards shore was a Herculean struggle. The freezing water sapped body heat, causing uncontrollable shivering. The uneven bottom, with sand that sucked into boots with every step and possible hidden holes, made progress slow and painful. The weight of the sodden gear seemed to double with every meter, and all the while, relentlessly, enemy bullets continued to slice through the air overhead, sending up violent spray into the surrounding. Water hitting men left and right. Leaving the boat was not an escape, not the beginning of the race for the beach. It was merely the transition from one kind of hell, the claustrophobic squeeze and hailstorm on the ramp, to another, a plunge straight into the icy, deadly, and terrifyingly intimate chaos of the water. The literal red tide, expanded version. It was no longer the cold grey water of the English Channel that kissed the sands of Normandy that morning. Something was changing, subtly at first, then with terrifying speed, as the speedboats dropped their men directly into the line of fire, as machine guns tore into flesh and mortars exploded. The very essence of life began to leak into the sea. At first they were just dark, almost purple stains that dissolved quickly into the vastness, like ink spilled into a bucket of water. They were the first wounded, bleeding in the shallows, the first bodies to sink or float. But the carnage was relentless, industrial. The MG-42s kept spewing death. The mortars kept falling. Men were being hit in the water, on the ramp, on the first few meters of sand, and with each new victim, more blood joined the mix. Dark stains multiplied, spread, began to connect. The water in the surf zone, that turbulent strip where the waves are born and die on the beach, began to take on an ominous hue. A pale pink at first, then a deeper, more vibrant, almost unreal red. Soon they were no longer stains. The entire shallow stretch of water for hundreds of yards along the beach was visibly stained. It was blood, human blood, in such vast quantities that it defied comprehension beyond the sea's ability to quickly dilute it. The volume of dead and wounded men was so great, the bloodshed so intense, that nature itself seemed corrupted. The image was surreal, a feverish nightmare come true. The waves that rolled gently onto the shore no longer brought just white, salty foam. They brought sticky, pinkish, reddish foam that left dark marks on the wet sand as it receded. And floating in that grim water was the evidence of the tragedy. Bodies, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, rolling gently in the surf like lifeless logs. Some were face down, others on their backs, their pale faces turned up toward the grey sky or submerged. The olive-green uniforms, once a symbol of strength and organization, were now sodden, heavy, and stained with great dark red stains. Limbs were at odd angles, horrific wounds visible even from a distance. Among the bodies floated the wreckage of the battle. Steel helmets floating like empty bowls, M1 rifles adrift, waterlogged field backpacks, pieces of wood from the wrecked speedboats, life preservers empty or still attached to lifeless bodies. It was a watery graveyard, a grotesque soup of death and detritus, for the soldiers still struggling desperately to get out of the icy water, or for those who had already reached the sand and were now trapped under enemy fire, seeking any nook or cranny for cover. The sight was deeply demoralizing. It was a devastating psychological blow. They had to wade through the water, literally stepping over or among the bodies of their fallen comrades. The water felt sticky and strangely warm, from fresh blood, on their boots, on their pants. The metallic, sweet smell of blood hung heavy in the damp, salty air near the shore. It was a sight that burned the eyes and turned the stomach, an image that screamed of impending failure, of the futility of sacrifice. The red tide ceased to be a figure of speech, a hyperbole to describe violence. It became the literal, tangible, and sickening reality of those first hellish minutes on the beach. It was a baptism of fire and blood in the most literal and horrific sense possible. It was the visual signature of the massacre, the indisputable proof of the extreme brutality of the German defense and the terrible price that was being paid for every meter of that accursed beach. It was hell on earth, painted red. Running for death in the sand. Finally you feel the wet sand beneath your feet. No longer the unsteady rocking of the boat, no longer the metallic thud of the ramp opening, but ground, solid ground. For a moment, tiny and cruel, there is almost relief. Relief that evaporates the second your eyes look up. What lies before him is a waking nightmare. A wide, open, inhospitable sand plain stretches for hundreds of yards. There are no trees, no rubble, no semblance of cover. The only hope of shelter is a small drop-off ahead, a rocky outcrop perhaps, or the base of a cliff that seems as far away as salvation. That stretch of beach is now a slaughterhouse. The air vibrates with the sound of machine guns that have already opened fire. The sky is painted with flaming streaks, tracer bullets cutting like blades through the space between life and death. From well-camouflaged nests in the dunes and from concrete structures on the cliffs, the enemy fires without ceasing. At every moment, a new boom rips through the air. Mortars explode with brutal violence, throwing sand, stones and limbs in all directions. The shrapnel is invisible until it has already cut flesh. The sand, once golden, is now stained with blood and gunpowder and vibrates with the constant impact of the explosions. You know that standing still means dying. But what does running mean? Your body is heavy with wet gear. Each step sinking in like sand is mud. Your backpack seems to double in weight. Your boots don't conform, as they should. And fear is a hungry animal that claws at your insides and tries to stop your every move. But you move anyway, because there is no alternative. Men around him run, scream, stumble. Some fire their weapons without even aiming, more by reflex than intention. A comrade next to him takes a bullet in the chest and falls like a disjointed doll. Another, wounded in the legs, tries to crawl, leaving a red trail behind him before being silenced by another explosion. The smell of blood and burning flesh begins to compete with that of sea air and gunpowder. You run or try to run as if you were in a nightmare where every step requires superhuman strength. Instinct takes over. You zigzag, throw yourself to the ground when you hear the sharp whistle of an approaching projectile. You get up, stumble over a mutilated body, slip on a bloody helmet. Your eyes burn with sweat, sand, and tears. You don't even know what's what anymore. The sound is a continuous roar, the boom of cannons, the dry crack of machine guns, screams, cries, calls for help and for distant mothers. Time loses its meaning. A second seems like an eternity. Every meter you walk is an almost miraculous achievement, a victory against all odds. Your heart beats like a war drum, hammering inside your chest, trying to burst through your throat. Your breath is a desperate wheeze, burning your lungs like acid. There is no room for glory, heroism, or ideals. There is only survival. The goal is primitive, almost animal, to reach the next point alive, and then the next, step by step, race by race. All that exists is the distant promise of that shelter, and the imminent death that haunts it like a bloody shadow. And even if you make it there, even if your legs don't give out, even if no bullet takes your name, you will know that you have crossed a threshold. The beach is gone, but something inside you is gone too. Normandy didn't just take lives that day. It scarred souls with invisible scars, sealed in fire and fear. The sand didn't just absorb blood, it absorbed fear, courage, despair, and a kind of strength that only those who have run through that silent hell will understand. Lethal obstacles and traps. You run, or try to run. The soft sand still tugs at your feet like quicksand. The screams mix with the explosions, and each step is a pact between despair and hope. You believe, or try to believe, that if you can just walk a few more feet, if you can reach the next crater, maybe you can get a second of respite. But then, in the middle of hell, you realize the worst is yet to come. Because the field of death that stretches out before him is not just a stage for enemy fire from the cliffs, it is a living trap, meticulously constructed by minds that understood the psychology of destruction. Rommel didn't just want to kill soldiers, he wanted to crush them before they could even fight back. The first barrier appears almost like an ambush, inclined wooden stakes, thick and seemingly rough, but lethal in their function. Called Rommel's asparagus, many are embedded below the tide line, invisible until someone collides with them. Teleminds are fixed on the tips, waiting for the hull of a speedboat or the desperate step of a soldier to explode with devastating force. You remember seeing a ship split like paper when it touched one of these, a ball of fire, pieces of metal, and men thrown like dolls by the violence of the explosion. That was the prologue. Now you are inside the book. Further ahead, the threatening shapes of the Czech hedgehogs, rusting steel structures, crisscrossed at sharp angles, look like metallic creatures out of some surreal nightmare. They were meant to stop tanks, but here, on the sand, they function like iron guillotines, blocking your path and forcing you to choose, go around them and expose yourself to more fire, or try to get underneath and risk getting trapped. They cut off visibility, pushing groups into predictable death lanes, funneling the living into pre-planned firing zones. Every time you try to move forward, one of these monsters seems to appear out of nowhere, a cold wall between you and any sense of safety. And as if that weren't enough, on the final stretch of the beach, where the gravel meets the dunes, he awaits the final punishment. The barbed wire, dense, chaotic, cruel. It's not a fence, it's a maze of pain. Coils and coils intertwine into living metallic knots, waiting for human flesh. Soldiers stumble over them, fall face down, and are instantly entangled. Screams go up as the barbs dig into hands, legs, faces. Some try to cut their way through with pliers, but enemy fire doesn't give them time. Others get trapped, screaming, begging for help, only to be silenced by a well-aimed shot. You yourself approach one of these rollers. Your heart beats like a war drum. There is no choice, jump or die. You try to climb over, but your uniform rips. A splinter cuts your calf like a hot knife. Through butter, you hold back your scream, try to free yourself, but you can already feel the hot blood running down your spine. Behind you, others scream, push, try to get past, crowd together. The chaos becomes a whirlwind. There is no space, no order, only the brute force of survival. Each obstacle is not just a physical blockage, it is a blow to the mind. With each new barrier, hope crumbles a little more. These devices were not placed by chance. They followed a plan, a diabolical plan, calculated to the millimeter to transform the arrival of the Allies into a spectacle of annihilation. The beach became a testing ground for human resistance, physical, emotional, spiritual. It was not enough to reach the sand alive. It was necessary to cross a torture camp where everything was designed to destroy. You feel it in your burning muscles, in your shortness of breath, in the glazed eyes of your companions, and in the echo that screams inside your mind. How does one survive this? But then you remember what lies beyond the beach, the mission, what is at stake, and with your body wounded and your soul torn, you continue, because there are still meters to go, there are still obstacles to overcome, and hell, apparently, has no end. The cry of the wounded. You've crossed the water. You've run, or tried to run, across the bullet-riddled sand, dodging craters and corpses, tripping over the remains of those who came before. You've seen the obstacles. You've bled. And, as you struggle to move forward, more than the deafening roar of explosions or the sharp crack of machine guns, another sound begins to stand out amidst the chaos. The screams. They are not shouts of command, nor of bravery. They are visceral, raw, heart-breaking sounds. Screams that do not want to be heard, but that impose themselves. Screams that break something inside you every time they reach your ears. First, you hear a name, your name, being called from behind. A desperate, thin, choked voice. You turn around for a second, and there he is, the soldier who minutes before was beside you on the boat, with whom you shared a soggy cigarette. Now he is face down in the water, trying to get up, but with no strength in his arms. There is a trail of blood coming from his hip. He cannot move. The tide rises, licking his face, dyed red. He calls again. His voice fails, and you turn back to face forward. because you have to, because to stay is to die, but every step after that is a burden. He still screams inside your mind, even though the beach has swallowed him forever. Further ahead, another sound, a howl, almost animal-like. A man writhes in the sand, clutching a piece of his own leg, or what's left of it. The flesh is torn, the bones exposed. He screams and screams, his face distorted with pain. There's no doctor around, no help, just more enemy fire. Others moan, some cry, some call out for mommy with the voice of a wounded child, even though their bodies are already those of a grown man. There are whispered prayers and desperate pleas for God or for a doctor who will never come. And there are those low, continuous sounds, moans that last for minutes, the sounds of someone who is dying but has not yet crossed the final threshold. You pass them by, you have to pass them by. They reach out their hands, grab your leg, look into your eyes as if they can hold on to your life as theirs slips through their fingers. You let go, and you move on. And that's perhaps the worst part of it all. Because more than the fear of dying, more than the terror of being shot, there's the weight of leaving them behind. You tell yourself that you have to keep going, that you have a mission, that you can't stop. But that doesn't stop every face, every sound, every cry of pain from piercing you like invisible shrapnel that goes deep, far beyond the flesh. The doctors try to get there. Some make it. They carry kits on their backs, dragging themselves like ghosts between the explosions, but many fall before helping a single injured person. The beach does not respect the Red Cross emblem. Death makes no distinctions. You begin to understand that screams are not just the sound of physical pain. They are the testimony of reality. They are the soundtrack of human despair taken to the extreme. Screams that vibrate across the beach like echoes from an earthly hell. They enter through your ears, but lodge in your chest, making what is still human inside you tremble. They are screams that you will remember forever, screams that will continue to sound even when everything goes silent. At that moment, you understand. War is not just about shots and bombs. It is about sounds, about screams, and about the silences that come after, when the one who was screaming can no longer do so. Lost equipment, shattered hope. You keep crawling, bleeding, stumbling over bodies, stakes and craters, the screams of the wounded clinging to your soul. But even though you've made it to the sand alive, you realize something crucial. You're more fragile than you ever imagined. Because now, beyond the fear, the pain and the confusion, there's a new terror creeping in. You lost your equipment. It wasn't carelessness. It was the water, the weight, the panic. As you jumped from the speedboat under fire, the sea swallowed you up to your chest. Your boots sank, your vest pulled down, and the M1 rifle, wet and slippery, slipped from your gloved hands. You tried to hold on to it, God knows you tried, but it disappeared into the dark water, washed away by the waves, or buried in the sand at the bottom. A second later, an explosion ripped through the side of the ramp, and you swam like a madman for shore, not knowing what you were still carrying. Now, lying there behind a tiny rise of sand, you grope desperately for something familiar, the butt of your gun, the handle of a grenade, anything you can use. But there's nothing, no rifle, no ammunition, not your small medical bag. And the helmet? God, the helmet. When did it go? You look around. Others are in the same situation. Men gasping for breath, some with wild eyes, trying to rip the ammunition belts off their dead comrades. Others crawl toward the bodies to pull out a rifle or a pistol. There is no time for ceremony. There is no room for guilt. If you don't grab it now, you'll be the next to go. It's kill or be wiped out before you've even fired a single shot. The loss of equipment there, on. That cursed beach goes beyond military logic. She attacks the soldier's heart, because the gun is not just a tool. It is an extension of the will to live. It represents power, control, chance. Without it, you are not a warrior. You are just a target. And knowing that you are vulnerable, unarmed, useless in the face of the German machine, tears the mind more than any physical wound. Others have lost their grenades in the sea, or had to abandon them to swim. First aid kits have come. Loose, fallen, and been trampled on. A man runs past him with empty hands, his eyes lost, repeating, my rifle, like a prayer or a curse. Further ahead, another tries to protect his head with his bare hands because his helmet is long gone. He runs, stumbles, falls, and does not get up. And that's when you see the real impact. It's not just the equipment that's disappearing, it's the hope. It is falling apart along with the ammunition belts and empty holsters. The morale, already cracked before the landing, is now like shattered porcelain on the sand, dirty with blood and salt. The confidence in oneself, the belief in the mission, everything begins to seem like a cruel farce. The beach was supposed to be the beginning of liberation. But there, with your body soaked, your heart in tatters, and nothing in your hands to fight with, you feel like a spectre. A man who has fallen into purgatory, waiting for the final bullet that will free him from this nightmare. And yet, you move, because maybe a few feet ahead there is a rifle lying around, maybe there is shelter, maybe there is still a chance, and it is for that maybe that you keep crawling, even though the equipment is behind, even though part of your soul is with it. The impenetrable wall. You are alive. That in itself is almost unbelievable. Every step up has been a challenge of survival, from the freezing heavy water to the killing field on the sand, past the cruel booby traps and the piercing echo of the wounded screams. Reaching the gravel line or the base of the cliffs seems an impossible victory, a chance to breathe, to finally escape the hell. But that relief is a quick poison. All you have to do is look up, and what you see ahead is worse than any explosion or scream. A wall, a monster of concrete, steel, wire, and death. The cliffs of Normandy, especially at Omaha, are not just natural formations. They were shaped by man to kill. High, steep, cold as the steel they guard, they have become nightmarish fortresses. From where you stand, they seem alive, breathing hatred and ammunition. Every rise, every depression, every rock hides something. A machine gun, a mortar, a sniper. Concrete pillboxes, perfectly camouflaged, form a system of interlocking defenses, designed not to resist, but to massacre. Up there, the Germans see everything, every move, every attempt to advance. They don't fire at random. They choose, they calculate, they execute. The crossfire makes every advance a death sentence. And, as if that weren't enough, the flanks of the wall are protected by barbed wire, mines, and carefully placed obstacles. Every potential path is a trap. And then comes the psychological toll. You've run out of breath, lost your companions, cried inside as you heard the agonizing screams that seemed to come from every direction. You've left essential equipment behind and escaped bullets and shrapnel by inches. Now, faced with this colossal wall, your mind screams a new truth. There is no way to pass. She seems invincible, immune to courage, unmoved by sacrifice. You look around. Other soldiers are there too, sitting, lying down, collapsed. Some are praying, others just stare up, eyes glazed over, trying to calculate the impossible. One man holds his helmet in his hands, as if it offers some comfort. Another tries to wipe sand from his rifle scope, though he seems to know it won't make any difference if he has to climb up there bare-chested. Morale, already shattered from the water, is now dust. It is at this moment that many feel that all is lost, that crossing the beach was just the prelude to true condemnation. That fate has already been sealed, to die there, squeezed between the sand that is already a mass grave and the cliff that rises like a silent executioner. And yet someone moves. An officer shouts orders, even though they are muffled by the roar of weapons. Another soldier stands up and begins to climb, taking cover as best he can among the rocks. And another follows, not out of heroism perhaps, but because standing there is certain death. Because even when faced with the impossible, the instinct to fight still burns in some, and little by little, step by step, inch by inch, the wall begins to be challenged. The Atlantic Wall was not just concrete and steel, it was a monument to fear, and every man who dared to face it Even crawling, even staggering, was challenging more than a fortification. He was challenging the very logic of war, and the idea that it was insurmountable. Leadership dismantled. Before the landing, everything seemed to be in place. Months of planning, repetitive drills, maneuver rehearsals, maps memorized down to the last detail. Every platoon knew its mission. Every soldier knew who to follow. The structure was clear, efficient, military. Experienced officers and sergeants had studied the terrain, gone over the communication codes, visualized the routes of advance. There was a plan, and men to lead it. But war does not respect plans. The brutal reality of the beach made these leaders, lieutenants, captains, sergeants, warrant officers, the most vulnerable, the most sought-after targets. They had to be in the lead. They had to look over the makeshift cover. They had to shout orders above the roar of machine guns, and the experienced enemy, positioned with precision on the cliffs, knew this. German guns did not fire at random. They sought targets with purpose. A man who exposed himself, who gestured, who shouted commands, was cut down in seconds. Many officers never made it to the shore. They were hit in the boats during the final seconds before landing. Others fell as they took their first steps into the shallow water, their sector maps still pinned to their chests. Sergeants, who often served as the backbone of the platoon, fell as they tried to rally men under fire or cut barbed wire with bolt cutters. Imagine what this would do to the soldiers. You step off the boat into a whirlwind of bullets and explosions, adrenaline fighting against terror. Your instincts tell you, follow your leader. But then you see the lieutenant get hit in the chest, fall backwards into the water, and not get up. The sergeant next to him tries to pull him up and gets hit too. In less than a minute, your command structure disappears, and what's left? The sound of bullets, the screams, the chaos. Without leadership, cohesion dissolves. Platoons fragment. Soldiers lose contact with one another. Disparate. Units blend into a shapeless mass. Men shout names, codes, commands, but the deafening noise renders any communication nearly useless. Some try to take the lead to improvise, but most throw themselves to the ground, cowering behind small sandbanks, metal debris, or the bodies of comrades, waiting for any sign of guidance. The impulse to advance, so vital to the operation, is swallowed up by collective paralysis. In many parts of the beach, the attack stalled. Not for lack of courage. There was plenty of courage, but for lack of direction. It was like a body with nerves on fire and no brain to coordinate its movements. Individual desperation replaced coordinated action. Each man began to fight not for a military objective, but for his own survival. And this ripple effect didn't just affect the rank and file. When senior officers finally made it onto the beach, they often found a scene they didn't recognize. Disorganized units, aborted missions, forgotten objectives. The lieutenant who was supposed to lead the left flank? Dead. The machine gun support platoon? Scattered. The radio operator? Down with his equipment. The structure had disintegrated. At Omaha, especially, this disorganization nearly meant the total collapse of the operation. For hours, the advance was suspended, frozen by the combined effect of enemy fire and lack of command. Only with time, and with a superhuman dose of initiative on the part of isolated soldiers and surviving officers, did small groups begin to regroup, find replacement leaders, and improvise plans. But the cost of that command vacuum in the first hours was measured in hundreds of lives, and the near-complete failure of the landing. The cold, hard truth is that without their leaders, the soldiers didn't know where to go, and on the beach of death to stand still was almost always to die. The first acts of desperate bravery. The beach had become a purgatory of steel and blood. Meticulous plans had been shattered in the first few minutes. Formations were broken. Leadership dismantled, equipment lost, and the terrain was transformed into a perfectly calculated killing field. In many places, it seemed as if the invasion had failed. Men lay motionless, huddled behind small ripples in the sand, shaking, praying, crying, hoping that the next shot would not be the last they heard. It was the end of the line. But then, against all logic, something started to happen. It wasn't sudden, nor was it heroically orchestrated like in the movies. It was organic. It was instinctive. It was human. In the midst of absolute chaos, small acts of resistance began to emerge, fragile, isolated, but stubbornly present, like weeds sprouting between the cracks in the concrete. Maybe it started with some sergeant, someone with a bruised arm covered in sand and blood, who looked around and saw the blank stares of the boys around him. And then, without a plan, without guarantees, with only the conviction that remaining lying down was a death sentence, he pulled himself up enough to shout, "With me!" And he began to crawl. It was not an elaborate order. It was a cry for survival, and someone followed him. Then another. Soon 5 or 6 men were crawling behind him, advancing meter by meter, pressing their faces into the sand, using blast craters, bits of wire, any shade as temporary shelter. At another point, a private soldier, perhaps under 20, perhaps already a father of 2, saw his friends falling one by one under the relentless fire of a German machine gun nest. There were no orders, no reinforcements, only desperation. And in an irrational impulse, he half raised himself, took aim with his waterlogged rifle, and began to fire. Not out of tactics, but out of rage, out of helplessness, to give someone even the slightest chance, even if it was just to breathe. The combat engineers were perhaps the most insane acts of the morning, carrying the heavy explosive charges known as Bangalores, long steel tubes. Filled with TNT, they crawled like living shadows, pushing the canisters toward barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles. Every inch they traveled under fire was a direct negotiation with death. When they got close enough, one of them would light the fuse with shaking hands, shout "Fire!" and throw himself back, hoping the explosion would clear the way, and that he would still be alive when the smoke cleared. There were also those who simply improvised. Soldiers advanced alone along the flanks, trying to avoid the machine gun's field of vision. Others threw grenades aimlessly toward the sound of the enemy. Many used the bodies of their fallen comrades as a barrier against the bullets, not out of disrespect, but because it was the only cover available. Every meter was earned with blood, sweat, and the constant promise of imminent death. These were not acts of idealized bravery. There were no speeches, no flags, no triumphant music. There was fear, pain, urgency. Each advance was a desperate cry against annihilation. It was the denial of surrender. Many of these early efforts failed. Men were blown to pieces before they even got close to the enemy. Explosives failed. Improvised flankings ended in ambushes. But even these failed attempts carried a tremendous weight. They were signs that the will to fight still burned amid the ashes. Every explosion, every single shot, every soldier who decided not to die lying down created small cracks in the illusion of invulnerability of the German defenses. And over time, these isolated acts began to add up. One small group found another. A leaderless soldier was adopted by an unknown sergeant. Grenades hit targets. Enemy machine guns began to fall silent, one by one, and the wall, once impenetrable, began to show its flaws. Slowly, cruelly, but inevitably. The first acts of desperate bravery did not win the battle, but without them, it would never have been won. Isolated in hell. To the average soldier, the one without detailed maps or a bird's-eye view of the operation, the D-Day invasion did not seem part of a grand strategic plan. It was not an Allied maneuver coordinated by generals in tents or command rooms. It was just him, his rifle, if he still had one, and the utter chaos. Operation Overlord had now become a deeply individual, suffocating, almost claustrophobic experience. War to him was a patch of beach perhaps 10 square meters wide, shrouded in smoke, deafening noise, and death. Vision was limited. Smoke. From explosives, gunfire, and burning bodies formed a thick haze that obscured everything just a few steps ahead. Sound was a wall of noise. The steady boom of MG-42 machine guns, the piercing whistle of bullets flying past, explosions that seemed to suck in the air before sending shrapnel flying in every direction. The earth shook, the sand vibrated, the entire beach seemed to pulse with violence. Communication was non-existent. The radio, when it wasn't destroyed, was inoperative, wet, jammed by interference, or simply with no one on the other side to respond. Shouting was futile. Your voice was lost in the cacophony of battle. Raising your head to look for someone in command was effectively a death sentence. Many who tried were instantly cut down, like sitting ducks in a carefully planned firing range. The leaders who were supposed to coordinate action were gone, dead, wounded, or as lost as the men under their command. What was left was instinct. The soldier cowered behind a check. Hedgehog, a tiny mound of sand, a body that had fallen moments before. Around him were a few comrades, some acquaintances, some strangers from other units, all equally stunned. The expressions on their faces said it all. Pure fear, waiting for the next fatal shot, the hope that perhaps someone else would know what to do. And all the while, time passed. Seconds that seemed like hours. The sun rose, making the beach even more visible to enemy snipers on the cliffs. The tide rose, pushing the water, and with it the bloated bodies of the dead against the feet of the living. The usable space was shrinking with every minute. Men were trapped, crushed between death on the sand and the relentless advance of the sea. Doubt began to creep in like poison. Are we the only ones who have arrived? Have all the other units been destroyed? Did the Germans win before the invasion even began? Are we abandoned here? Forgotten? This feeling of abandonment was not just a feeling, it was a psychological breakdown. The mind, deprived of information, leadership and hope, began to give way. For many, the only reality was that immediate bubble of survival, not being hit in the next second. No sense of progress, victory or mission, only fear and pain. Each small group was fighting its own war, unsure whether what they were doing had any greater purpose. One soldier was trying to crawl toward an obstacle. Another was trying to improvise a barricade of bodies and destroyed equipment. A third, wounded, just moaned softly, waiting for the end. There was no way of knowing whether their efforts were worth it. It seemed like a vacuum, a void of purpose, where even screams seemed to vanish into the powder-saturated air. Being isolated in that hell was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. More than the bullets, more than the mines, more than the blood-red sand, it was the feeling of insignificance and loneliness that crushed the men's spirits. They fought as best they could, but they did not know if there was still a war to be won, or if they were just dying in vain. And yet, some kept going. The threshold of rupture. There was a moment on that morning of June 6th when everything seemed to fall apart. Not just the plan, but hope itself. At Omaha Beach, specifically, the elements of tragedy had aligned with cruel precision. The beach had gone from being an organized landing site to a purgatory of steel and blood. Every second that passed brought the operation closer to the brink. The threshold of rupture was in sight and nearly crossed. The beach, which should have been taken quickly in the first few hours, became a narrow, congested funnel. The first battalions that managed to land were trapped there, squeezed between the advancing sea and the cliffs that were still spitting fire. The sand was unrecognizable, a terrain torn apart by explosions, littered with craters, shrapnel, remnants of equipment, mangled bodies, and men too alive to ignore but too wounded to fight. Sherman DD tanks, which were supposed to provide heavy cover, had either sunk in the crossing or been destroyed shortly after arriving. Those that remained were immobilized, smoldering like grotesque torches in the middle of the beach. Jeeps and trucks were stuck, broken into pieces or abandoned, serving only as obstacles or makeshift shields. The sea, far from being an ally, was beginning to rise, swallowing the dead and pushing the living ever closer to the German defenses. Each new boat that arrived brought more men, but also more targets, more confusion, more chaos. Many jumped into the water under heavy fire, only to sink, drown, or be shot down before they even reached the shore. The beach was too crowded for tactical maneuvers and too exposed for any kind of security. It was a killing field. To the officers aboard the command ships at sea, the sight was apocalyptic. Binoculars revealed scenes of unrelenting horror. Platoons decimated, flares fired randomly, no visible movement. Toward the enemy defenses, the radio transmitted only broken snippets of desperate messages. Some commanders began to wonder if they were witnessing not a successful invasion, but the beginning of a colossal military disaster, perhaps the greatest in modern history. And on the sand, the feeling was even more suffocating. Many soldiers were almost out of ammunition. There were men with unloaded rifles and wet grenades, hiding behind bodies or debris, breathing hard, eyes wide, not knowing where to run. The military hierarchy had dissolved. The sergeants were dead, the lieutenants too. Informal leadership was emerging among the survivors, but even the bravest were beginning to waver in the face of reality. There was no progress. There was no plan. There was only the expectation of death, which could come from in front, from above, from behind. Doubt set in like an infectious disease. The thought, still whispered, still unspoken, that the mission had failed, that they would be swept back into the sea, that the sacrifice had been in vain, that the enemy's stronghold was simply invulnerable. The silence between volleys was filled with this collective fear, which gnawed at the spirit and paralyzed even the most seasoned veterans. This was the tipping point, the threshold of rupture. They were on the brink of catastrophe, not strategic but human, a widespread psychological breakdown. This was the moment when bravery and training were almost not enough, the moment when the history books might have written a completely different outcome for D-Day. But it was precisely at that moment, with defeat almost complete, that the first signs of resistance appeared. They were small reactions, a group that managed to outflank a machine gun nest, an engineer who detonated a passage in the barbed wire, a wounded lieutenant who dragged men out of the kill zone and resumed command. And each of these gestures, no matter how small, had repercussions, like small cracks in the wall of despair. These acts began to multiply, still under heavy fire, still with brutal losses, but now with a fragile, almost imperceptible impulse of movement. It was enough to prevent complete collapse, enough to keep the chance of victory alive, however distant. But at that moment, at that very point on the threshold, the Normandy invasion was on the brink of tragedy. The world would never know how close you had come to total failure. At the end of that day, June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were still, covered in blood, smoke and silence, interrupted by the groans of the wounded. The sand, once golden, had become a makeshift cemetery. The numbers speak of thousands of dead, wounded and missing, but no number can convey what was faced there. And yet, despite it all, the chaos, the failed plans, the near defeat, the indescribable pain, they got it. Meter by meter, position by position, trench by trench, the impossible was achieved by sheer human will, not by technological superiority, not by luck, but by the stubborn refusal to give up, by the desperate bravery of ordinary men thrown against a wall of steel and death, and who pressed on anyway. D-Day was not a clean victory, nor a glorious one in the traditional sense. It was a dirty, hard-fought victory, won on the edge of a knife and at an almost unbearable price, but it was a victory, and with it, the fall of Nazi terror in Europe began. Freedom, so distant that morning, began its slow and painful return. The story could have ended. There on that beach, with bodies washed away by the tide and dreams shattered on barbed wire. But it didn't, because even in the depths of hell, someone got up. And when one stands up, others follow. That was the real miracle of D-Day. It was not the success of the strategy, but the strength of the spirit, the certainty embedded in the mud and fire that darkness only wins when no one fights anymore. That day, humanity fought and won.